The 2000s were a golden era for RPGs. Studios were experimenting, risks were being taken, and somehow the games that came out of that time managed to feel both ambitious and personal in ways that a lot of modern blockbusters just don't. These weren't just numbers and loot grinds. They were worlds that stayed with you, characters that felt alive, and stories that actually made you stop and think. Even today, some of them outshine the biggest new releases. So let's take a trip back and revisit 10 RPGs from the 2000s that are still better than most of what we're playing now. If you could, please subscribe and ring the bell. Also leave a like if you like the content. When Fable launched in 2004 on the original Xbox, it carried the kind of hype most games can't live up to. Peter Molyneux promised players a living, breathing world that would react to every choice, where you could plant an acorn and watch it grow into a tree over the years. The reality, of course, fell short of those grand ideas. The acorns never sprouted. The world wasn't quite as reactive as advertised, and critics were quick to call out the gap between promise and execution. But despite all that, Fable carved out something special. Albion was a whimsical mix of fairy tale and grit, a place where moral choices weren't just numbers on a screen. You actually saw them shape your character. Become a noble hero, and villagers cheered your name. Give in to darker urges, and horns literally sprouted from your head. It was cartoonish, yes, but it made morality feel tangible in a way most RPGs didn't. The combat was simple, maybe even shallow compared to other RPGs of its time, but it was accessible. Magic, melee, and ranged attacks could all be mixed on the fly, letting you carve out a playstyle without diving into complex menus. And while the main quest was short, side activities like buying property, getting married, or just causing chaos gave the game a playful personality. Of course, the flaws are easy to see now. The world was smaller than expected, the story felt thin, and the much-hyped freedom was more illusion than reality. But there's a reason people still look back on Fable with fondness. It had charm. Its tongue-in-cheek humor, colorful world, and mix of lightheartedness with just enough darkness gave it an identity few RPGs have matched. Modern RPGs might be bigger and deeper, but Fable reminds us that sometimes heart and personality matter more than scale. It overpromised, sure, but it also delivered something unforgettable. When Demon's Souls released on the PS3, hardly anyone expected much. Sony themselves didn't even think it would catch on. At first, they didn't want to publish it outside Japan. It was slow, brutal, and unforgiving in an era where most RPGs were trying to be more cinematic and accessible. But what seemed like a niche curiosity ended up sparking an entire genre, laying the foundation for Souls-likes. What made it different was its uncompromising vision. Levels weren't sprawling open worlds. They were tightly designed gauntlets full of traps, hidden shortcuts, and enemies that punished recklessness. Death wasn't the end, it was the teacher. Every failure taught you something, and slowly mastering those lessons made victories feel earned in a way few games could match. The eerie atmosphere, lonely world, and cryptic story only deepened the sense of mystery, making you feel like you'd stumbled into something both dangerous and sacred. That said, Demon's Souls had plenty of rough edges. The frame rate struggled. The world tendency system, I feel, was confusing even for veterans, and online features, like other players leaving cryptic messages, felt more bizarre than innovative at first. Some critics outright dismissed it as too punishing or archaic, and it definitely wasn't for everyone. But here's the thing. Those flaws became part of its identity. The difficulty wasn't just about being hard for the sake of hard. It was about building tension, forcing patience, and creating a sense of triumph. And in a market full of safe, streamlined RPGs, Demon's Souls stood out by refusing to compromise. Looking back now, it feels like the spark that reignited RPG design for the next decade. Without it, there's no Dark Souls, no Elden Ring, no wave of games chasing that same mix of challenge and discovery. It wasn't perfect, but it changed the industry forever. Released in 2000, Deus Ex didn't just start a new series. It quietly redefined what an RPG could be. Set in a dystopian near future of conspiracies, corporate control, and cybernetic enhancements, It blurred the line between shooter and RPG in ways that were unheard of at the time. You weren't just running through levels. You were making decisions about how to approach them. Hack a terminal, pick a lock, sneak past guards, or kick the door down guns blazing. The choice was always yours. What made it special was how those choices carried through the entire game. Missions didn't funnel you down one correct path. If you invested in hacking, suddenly entire story branches opened up through terminals and emails. If you went heavy into combat, you could brute force your way through encounters, though it was never easy. That freedom gave Deus Ex a kind of immersive depth that most modern RPGs still struggle to match. Of course, the cracks showed even back then. The graphics were blocky and dated almost immediately, even by 2000 standards. The voice acting swung between charmingly stiff and unintentionally hilarious. And the combat, while flexible, could feel clunky, especially when compared to straight-up shooters of the era. Many players bounced off it for being too complex, too slow, or just too unpolished. But for those who stuck with it, Deus Ex offered something few games ever had: the sense that your intelligence was being respected. It didn't spell everything out. It let you fail, experiment, and stumble into unexpected outcomes. And it wrapped all of that in a story that touched on surveillance, government control, and bioengineering, topics that feel even more relevant now than they did back then. 2 decades later, people still call it one of the greatest games ever made. Not because it was flawless, but because it trusted players to think for themselves. That kind of design philosophy is rare today, which is why Deus Ex still feels ahead of its time. When Persona 3 dropped, it redefined what a JRPG could be. At first glance, it seemed like a weird mix of high school life during the day, dungeon crawling at night, with a hidden dark hour wedged in between. But that structure was the magic. Instead of just grinding through battles, you had to balance friendships, exams, and the pressure of an entire secret world that no one else could see. It almost felt alive in a way that RPGs before it rarely did. That said, it's not perfect. In hindsight, the combat is pretty straightforward compared to later entries, and the fact that you couldn't directly control your party members outside of issuing tactics made the AI more frustrating than fun. The dungeon design also leaned repetitive. Tartarus is basically one massive tower of randomly generated floors, which can wear thin after dozens of hours. A lot of critics pointed that out back then, and they weren't wrong. But here's why it still stands tall even now. Mood. Few RPGs capture the weight of mortality, loneliness, and the passage of time the way Persona 3 does. The calendar system makes every choice feel meaningful. The soundtrack swings between melancholic and energizing, and the blue-tinted aesthetic wraps it all in a kind of stylish gloom. Even with its flaws, it made players feel something, which is more than can be said for a lot of overly polished but emotionally flat RPGs today. Looking back, you can see how it paved the way for the genre to get bolder, stranger, and more character-driven. Modern Persona games may be slicker, but Persona 3 still has a raw, unpolished heart that hits just as hard now as it did in 2006.
Well, we're real high up. I think I'm gonna hurry.
Released in 2007 on the 360, Lost Odyssey was Microsoft's big swing at capturing the Japanese RPG audience. And with Final Fantasy veteran Hironobu Sakaguchi at the helm, it had all the ingredients to succeed. On paper, it looked like just a traditional turn-based RPG with high production values. But what set it apart was its emotional weight. You play as an immortal who's lived for 1,000 years, and the game constantly explores what that actually means. The centerpiece wasn't even the battles. It was the short stories scattered throughout, written as little novellas, unpacking the heartbreak of outliving everyone you've ever loved. Critics back then were split. On one hand, the writing in those 1,000 Years of Dreams segments was praised as some of the best storytelling ever put into a game. On the other hand, the gameplay was seen as too old school. The random encounters dragged, the pacing stumbled, and the load times were brutal. People who were already drifting toward action-heavy RPGs like Mass Effect or Oblivion weren't impressed by a game that clung so tightly to tradition. But in hindsight, that's exactly why it shines. Lost Odyssey wears its classic JRPG DNA proudly. Methodical combat, party synergy, big emotional arcs, while layering on an almost literary sense of reflection. The visuals, though dated now, still carry that crisp mid-2000s charm, and the soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu adds a sweeping, melancholic edge that elevates the whole experience. It's the kind of game that feels like it slipped through the cracks. Overshadowed at launch, underappreciated by critics, and never re-released to reach a new audience, Lost Odyssey has become a lost treasure. For players willing to deal with its slower pace, it delivers a level of emotional storytelling most modern RPGs can't touch. It might not have redefined the genre, but it reminded people what RPGs could feel like, and that's worth remembering. When Oblivion launched in 2006, it was a jaw-drop moment. A massive open world with rolling hills, bustling cities, and the promise that you could go anywhere, do anything, and be anyone. Compared to the darker, niche appeal of Morrowind, this was Bethesda going mainstream. Stepping out of the sewers and into Cyrodiil for the first time felt like a revelation. What made Oblivion shine was its freedom. You could be a thief sneaking into locked homes, a mage mastering spells, or a gladiator fighting your way through the arena. Guild questlines like the Dark Brotherhood are still some of the best Bethesda has ever written. Equal parts sinister, dramatic, and unforgettable. And the Radiant AI system, even if it was buggy, gave NPCs daily routines that made the world feel oddly alive. But even so, oh boy, did the flaws show. The infamous potato-faced character models and stiff animations are meme-worthy now. The level scaling system meant that instead of feeling powerful, enemies just got stronger with you, making fights against random bandits absurdly tough in the late game. And while the Oblivion Gates were a cool concept, their repetitive design quickly turned them into a slog. Despite that, Oblivion nailed the sense of wonder. The world felt handcrafted, filled with little secrets tucked into caves, ruins, and dungeons. The soundtrack by Jeremy Soule gave the game a dreamlike quality that still hits hard today. And even with its technical clumsiness, the sheer ambition of Oblivion made it stand out as one of the defining RPGs of its decade. Modern open-world RPGs may be prettier and smoother, but few match the sheer awe of stepping into Cyrodiil for the first time.
Find what the Geth are after, and you'll all get out of here alive.
Back in 2007, Mass Effect felt like a promise fulfilled. BioWare had already shown they could do branching narratives with Knights of the Old Republic. But this was something bigger. A fully original sci-fi universe where your decisions shaped the fate of the galaxy. Stepping into Commander Shepard's boots, you weren't just playing through a story, you were writing your version of it. Conversations had weight, relationships could shift based on your choices, and even small decisions left ripples that carried into sequels. What set it apart wasn't just the branching dialogue, but the world building. The Citadel alone felt more alive than most entire RPGs, filled with alien species, political tension, and lore that made the universe feel ancient and lived in. The morality system, while not perfect, gave players a clear identity as either a paragon or a renegade, and it added a sharp edge to role-playing that was missing in most RPGs of the time. Still, it had its flaws, big ones. The combat was clunky, leaning heavily on clumsy, cover shooting, and awkward gunplay. The infamous Mako exploration sections felt more like chores than adventures, and the inventory system was such a mess it became infamous. On top of that, the performance on the 360 often dipped, and the visuals, though ambitious, were rough around the edges compared to what the sequels would achieve. But none of that stopped Mass Effect from being revolutionary. Even today, modern RPGs struggle to replicate the feeling of your story truly being yours. The way BioWare made characters feel like lifelong companions gave the game a human core beneath all the sci-fi spectacle. It wasn't flawless, but it was bold. And that boldness is why it still stands taller than most RPGs made today.
You'd probably be dead just like all the others.
Back when Dragon Age Origins came out, it felt like BioWare's answer to the people who thought Mass Effect was a little too streamlined. Instead of sci-fi, we got a grim medieval world steeped in politics, betrayal, and a looming apocalypse. What really made it special was how personal the story could feel right from the start. Your origin wasn't just a prologue. it shaped how the world treated you. A noble-born character would get respect in court, while a city elf might face outright disdain. That kind of reactive storytelling was rare then, and it still is now. The combat was another throwback, leaning closer to tactical RPGs like Baldur's Gate. On PC especially, you could pause the fight, queue up commands, and really dig into strategy. It gave battles weight, forcing you to use positioning, spells, and tactics rather than just brute force. The version on console streamlined things, but the spirit was the same, a slower, more thoughtful kind of RPG combat that had all but disappeared today, until BG3. Of course, it wasn't perfect. The graphics were rough, even for 2009, with stiff animations and faces that looked waxy at best. Some areas dragged on too long, and the difficulty could spike wildly, depending on your party setup. It also carried the usual BioWare quirks. Romances that sometimes felt rushed, choices that boiled down to clear good versus evil, and dialogue wheels that occasionally box you in. With that said, the available options still kept the illusion of choice strong. But despite those flaws, Dragon Age Origins captured something RPG fans have been craving. Depth, a sense that the world didn't revolve around you, that factions had their own agendas, and that every choice could cost you something. Later Dragon Age entries went flashier and were less concerned with keeping up that illusion of choice. And that's why Origins still feels like the most grounded and layered of the series. And in many ways, it outshines most modern RPGs. When Vampire: The Masquerade Bloodlines released in 2004, it was a mess, rushed out to meet deadlines, plagued with bugs, and running on an unfinished version of the Source engine. It was almost unplayable at launch. Reviews hammered it, sales tanked, and it seemed destined to be forgotten. And yet, for the players who stuck with it, or came back years later with fan patches, it became a cult classic, one of the most unique RPGs of its time. The brilliance of Bloodlines comes from its atmosphere and role-playing depth. You're a freshly turned vampire in modern-day Los Angeles, thrown into a world of supernatural politics, ancient rivalries, and seedy nightclubs. Unlike most RPGs of the era, Bloodlines gave you multiple clans to choose from, each dramatically altering how the game felt. Play as a charismatic Toreador and charm your way through problems, or pick the Nosferatu and be forced into the shadows, creeping through sewers because your monstrous face couldn't blend into human society. Few games have ever made your character choice feel so impactful. But the cracks were impossible to ignore. Combat was clunky, AI was laughable, and entire quest lines were left half-broken. Some players couldn't even finish the game without patches. It was clear the ambition far outweighed the resources Troika Games had to pull it off. Yet despite all that, or maybe because of it, Bloodlines carved out a permanent place in RPG history. The writing was sharp, dripping with dark humor and gothic style. Characters like Jeanette Vorman are still talked about today, not just because they were stylish, but because they were written with real personality. The setting felt alive, grimy, and unforgettable in a way few RPGs since have managed. Modern games may be bigger and cleaner, but few take risks the way Bloodlines did. It's messy, yes, but it's the kind of beautiful mess that sticks with you long after the credits roll. When Final Fantasy X launched on the PS2, it wasn't just another entry in the series. It was a technological leap. Fully voiced cutscenes, richly detailed 3D environments, and the cinematic presentation made it feel like Square was pushing RPGs into a new age. For fans, it was the first time the series felt alive in a literal sense, with characters speaking their lines instead of text boxes carrying the weight. The story of Titus, Yuna, and the pilgrimage across Spira hit hard because it blended a personal love story with larger themes of faith, sacrifice, and the cycle of destruction. The looming presence of sin wasn't just a villain. It was this existential dread hanging over the entire world. And the Sphere grid system gave players a sense of freedom to grow characters in unique ways, making the progression system one of the most addictive the franchise had ever seen. But FF10 wasn't without its bumps. The voice acting, though groundbreaking at the time, is famously uneven. Even though in context it's more understandable, that awkward laughing scene has been memed to death for a reason. Its linear structure also frustrated players who loved the freedom of Final Fantasy VII and IX. The first half of the game is essentially a straight corridor. Some fans saw it as Square sacrificing exploration for spectacle, a trend that only grew stronger in later titles. Even with those criticisms, Final Fantasy X remains a defining RPG of the 2000s. Its emotional ending still gets talked about today. The soundtrack is one of the strongest in the series, and a mix of high drama and spiritual themes gave it a weight that's hard to match. Modern Final Fantasy games have tried to capture that same balance of cinematic flair and heart, but to me this still stands out as the moment the series truly embraced its blockbuster potential, without losing the soul that made it special.